bell was the first lie. It hung from a split-beam frame at the edge of the clearing, pocked by weather and the small madnesses of winter, and it was supposed to mean safety, mornings, meals, the end of lessons. But on certain nights the hill carried a different sound, not a ring, more like a throat cleared in the dark, a low iron cough that sent the ravens into the trees and the children to their knees. In the ledger, a hand like snowfall, thin, deliberate, recorded the hours it spoke. That hand is said to belong to Clara Morton. In 1873, the seminary stood alone among buckthorn and limestone, 2 days by wagon from the nearest town. They called it a place of correction, a school for wayward minds after a war that had torn people from themselves. The Morton family ran it with the polish of piety, a father in a frock coat, a mother with hymns for evening, and Clara with a voice so calm the boys forgot their own names when she read. By spring, 5 students had vanished into explanation, consumption, conscription, the hunger that moves through young men like a patient fire. The bell tolled for none of them. This is a story people tell with their shoulders slightly turned, as if someone is still standing behind them. A story of stamped letters never posted, dried violets found between pages that were not prayers, and a well whose rope burned the hands that tried to pull whatever truth lay at the bottom. It is a history that never quite settles, less a narrative than a slow snowfall of details, cold, accumulating, erasing even as it reveals. If you listen long enough, the bell returns. If you look too long, the ledger does not. What we can prove feels narrower than what we can feel, and that perhaps is where the horror begins. The ridge was not meant to be a place of learning. Before the Mortons arrived, it was wind-scoured pasture where nothing taller than thistle dared stand. Locals called it the spare ground, a stretch of limestone and buckthorn, where the sky seemed to lower itself, pressing its grey face against the earth. After the war, when widows stitched flags from their husbands' shirts and young men returned with eyes that saw too far, a family climbed that hill with a cross, a charter, and a wagon-load of timber. They came like actors, entering a stage no one remembered building. Elijah Morton, tall, deliberate, wore his frock coat buttoned high, as if guarding something underneath. His wife, Temperance, moved with the brisk grace of a woman who measured virtue by the teaspoon, and Clara, their daughter. Clara had a voice people would later struggle to describe. Some said it was soft enough to smooth a fever. Others swore it carried something you didn't want to hear twice. Within weeks the ridge was transformed. White clapboard walls rose like teeth from the soil. A hand-painted sign in Latin promised sapientia et disciplina. Laundry snapped in the wind like surrender flags. Villagers stood at the base of the hill and nodded. Order, they thought. Correction. An answer to the restless boys who haunted tavern steps and stole apples as if hunger were a sport. The first pupils came from farms, orphan trains, and the spare corners of charity houses. Boys who had inherited silence instead of fathers. They arrived with a single change of clothes, boots stiff with other people's miles, and the kind of hunger no supper could quite settle. Elijah spoke to them of shaping spirits, temperance of softening tempers, while Clara read the Psalms in the main hall until even the fidgeting ones sat still. One boy later said, "It wasn't the words, it was the way she breathed between them." Like there was something in the pause they read. But the seminary was not all sermons and scripture. The room smelled faintly of chalk and lye, a clean sharpness that lived at the back of your tongue. Desks bore carvings, initials that could have been love or tally marks. Every window faced north, denying the classrooms the sun's warmth. Outside, at the clearing's edge, a bell hung from a split-beam frame. No rope, no clapper. Yet it was said that if Clara pressed her palm to its flank, it would sound a single low note, like breath caught in metal. "Do you hear it?" a farmhand once asked the blacksmith, tilting his head toward the ridge. The blacksmith paused, listening. "But I feel it somehow, here." He tapped the center of his chest. "And that's worse." The villagers embraced the seminary quickly, perhaps too quickly. Discipline felt like salvation after years of chaos. They brought baskets of eggs, bolts of cloth, even their own sons, placing them at the Mortons' door as if leaving offerings. In return, the family offered the appearance of progress, orderly lines of boys filing into prayer, letters home that spoke of improvement, of penmanship, of temperaments corrected. But when a mother asked to see her son's handwriting, she was told he had been too busy to keep a journal. There are places that are holy by design and others made holy by need. The Ridge, with its new white walls and borrowed Latin, was the latter. Yet the holiness felt conditional. It belonged not to God but to the Mortons, and it could be revoked as quietly as it was granted. One evening, as the sun bled itself behind the western trees, Clara stood alone beside the bell. The boy carrying firewood slowed, watching her hand rest on the pitted metal. "Will you ring it, miss?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment, then smiled, not unkindly but without warmth. "It doesn't ring for everyone." That night the wind off the ridge carried a sound the villagers could not place. Some swore it was the bell. Others insisted it was only the timbers settling in the cold. But a few, the ones who woke from uneasy dreams, said it sounded like a single voice, held in the throat of the hill, waiting for permission to be let out. It is here the question first took root. As small as a splinter and just as persistent. Is goodness a posture or a habit forged beneath the eyes of those who profit from our compliance? Arif. This is the fully expanded chapter 1 in the style you specified. Calm pacing, heavy atmosphere, 60-40 narration to dialogue, deep imagery, philosophical undertones, and a slow build of unease. February 1873. A thaw and a freeze had argued all night, leaving the hill slick as a held breath. The traveling locksmith, a man called Avery Pike in some ledgers and the tinker in others, arrived with a leather roll of tools and a limp no doctor ever cured. He was met at the door by Clara Morton, candle cupped against the draught. Her light made a halo of her hand, not her face. "You'll find the upstairs schoolroom," she said, voice winter soft. "The door has swollen. The boys must sing elsewhere until it learns its place." He nodded toward the staircase where faint hymn scraps drifted like ash. "They'll work best alone." "Then you will have the best of us," Clara replied, stepping aside. The hallway was narrow and clean, floored, scrubbed to the pale of bone. On the walls hung faded engravings, a lamb, a shepherd, a clock without hands painted into a pastoral sky. Avery counted steps because that was his habit. 12 to the landing, 8 to the door, another 3 where the floor dipped, as if under some remembered weight. He touched the swollen wood. It was warm, as if it had been held. He bent to the lock. Metal whispered to metal. From below, the boys' voices rose on a minor chord, then broke, as if someone had gently placed a palm on the music and pressed. The cough of bell tone, not quite a ring, more a throat clearing, shivered through the boards. He paused, head cocked. "Your bell, does it sound without a rope?" he called toward the stairwell. A footfall. Her voice from the shadow. "All bells sound when the air remembers." The mechanism yielded. The door unlatched with a sigh like fabric released from a corset. A smell breathed out, iron and lavender, blood and courtesy. Inside, the room was arranged like an answer that refused to reveal the question. A narrow cot, with scarcely a dip. A pitcher filmed with dust, its lip bruised by use. A chair no one sat in. He could tell by the way it faced the wrong thing. The only window met the well instead of the light, its frame painted shut, so neatly it may as well have been a painting of a window. On the far wall, 6 lengths of ribbon were tacked in a sober row. Blue, red, blue, red, white. They were ordinary ribbons, the kind boys wore on feast days or pinned to collars for recitations. Not a crime, not even evidence. Yet the white one had a crease near its end, as if it had once been tied around something that resisted being circled. Avery ran his thumb along the tacks. They held firm. He turned. On the windowsill sat a ledger, its calfskin scabbed with age. He opened it with the permission of someone paid to make doors talk. Entries marched in 2 columns. On the left, ink, neat as lace. On the right, a second set of words. The same but paled, as if written in water and left to dry into a ghost of themselves. He mouthed a line without sound. Quieted, the word appeared like a refrain, another notation temper corrected. Another night exercise. Between 2 pages, a pressed violet had bled its color into the paper, turning the crease into a bruise. He spoke to the emptiness. Who writes a thing twice to make it true? Have you found the trouble? Elijah Morton filled the doorway like an answer delivered too soon. Avery closed the book without shame, only your door's pride. It fought me and lost. Elijah's smile didn't move above the mouth. We find humility is the hinge of improvement. Will you bill us at the month's end? I see. Avery looked at the window. Faces the well. It faces what it must, Elijah said. As we all do. After the man left, Avery traced the room with his eyes the way a mason tests a wall by tapping it. In the corner, a small metronome sat mute, its pendulum arrested at an angle like a finger lifted for silence. He set it upright, then thought better and left it as he found it. On the cot, a hair so pale it was almost not there lay crosswise, a measure of time finer than any clock. He gathered his tools. As he passed Clara on the landing, she asked, "Was the smell too much?" "We use vinegar and lavender to keep the colds away." "I smell iron," he said before he could prevent his mouth. "And church." Her eyes, unoffended, held him as a lake holds a cloud. Sometimes a place must choose between the two. Downstairs the boys' singing had resumed, slower now. He saw one of them in the hallway, a narrow-faced child with a ribbon pinned crooked at his throat. Blue. The child's gaze snagged on Avery's tool roll, then flicked toward the staircase with the quickness of a rabbit watching a hawk. "You sing well," Avery offered. The boy swallowed. "We sing when told." "Do you sleep well?" The boy blinked as if the question were a trick. "We wake when told." A stray dog hovering at the threshold flattened its ears and refused to cross the sill. Avery stepped into the day. The sky had whitened to that particular color winter keeps for itself when it plans one last cruelty. He walked away, counting fence posts, listening without wanting to. Behind him, the bell made that low, mispronounced warning again, the kind of sound that makes a man check his pockets to see if one of his names has fallen out. He told no one, at first. A month and a county later, whiskey and distance loosened the lock of his tongue. At a tavern table sticky with old stories, he spoke to a barkeep who collected rumors like receipts. "Ribbons," the man repeated, polishing a glass already clean. "Colors mean discipline to church folk." "Or permission," Avery said. "Blue, red, blue, blue, red, white." "White for what?" "I don't know," Avery admitted. "I just know it was there." "Then what are you saying?" "I'm saying some rooms don't need windows," he murmured. "They have wells." The barkeep leaned in. "You saw her?" Avery felt his own mouth form the name like a key testing an unfamiliar lock. Clara. Something inside him swung open far enough to let the cold through. Years later, when he tried to write it down for himself, the room belonged to memory, which edits. He forgot the exact arrangement of dust, the precise pitch of the metronome's arrested breath, but the outline remained. A private cell that watched the well instead of the sun, a ledger written twice as if reality required rehearsal, a violet that bruised the page, a sequence of ribbons that felt like a sentence waiting for its verb. It was not a body, it was a pattern, quiet as hunger, specific as a hand arranging color until meaning appears, and like all patterns it begged a question. Do some things exist only because we believe they are arranged to? Or do we believe because once seen, we cannot pretend the order isn't there? News did what it always does. It ran into the nearest town, tripped on its own urgency, and was helped to its feet by people who would not let it say what it came to say. 2 days south, the streets wore February's brittle light and the windows kept their curtains half-drawn, as if modesty could rebuke the cold. In the forge, Jonas Reed folded heat into a horseshoe and spoke over the hiss. "Elijah Morton paid for the church roof," he said, the metal bright as confession. "Gave slates when we had none. Men who cover leaks in winter don't raise harm in spring." The apothecary, Mr. Harrow had the kind of ledger the law admires. Neat columns, no erasures. He tapped a page where Temperance Morton's name appeared with regularity. Lavender, vinegar, laudanum in small drafts. Almond oil, he read. For nerves, for cleaning, for sleep. A school is a nervous organism. He paused. They never owe me a cent. Mothers stopped at the churchyard where wind combed the grass to order, holding letters from the hill that said their sons had improved. Docile, one note said. Attentive, said another. A woman who had nearly become a widow once already pressed the page to her face as if her boy's breath might be there. Stern, supervised, sanctified, she murmured, as if flavoring the words might make them feed her. The sheriff, Emmett Dwyer, rode out, accepted tea, and returned with a report that sounded like a lullaby tasked with being a law. Premises in good order, he wrote. Dormitories clean. Pupils of sound appearance and docile beyond their years. No complaint beyond the cooling trembling of youth. That last phrase pleased him. It made nerves into a rite of passage. But the feed store had a different catechism. Against burlap and the dust of grain beetles, men measured stories the way they measured rope, finger to shoulder, pulled hard. Luke Carrow, a teamster with frost cracked into his knuckles, bent close. Saw them once, he said. Night processions, bare feet. Frost like ash on their soles. Her voice pacing them, not singing. No. Counting down. 1, 2, 3. Quiet. What were they carrying? Someone asked. Themselves, Luke replied, as if they were heavy. A widow named Mrs. Vale came for feed she could ill afford, and left a rumor she could not keep. He came back after a week, she said, and the house couldn't find him. He answered, but as if the answer had been set out for him beforehand. You know when a clock ticks with someone else's time. That. At Sunday service, Reverend Meacham preached with the fervor of a man who had convinced his doubt to dress as conviction. Beware the wolves that dress as lambs, he said, voice rising into the rafters, and the lambs who become wolves for a place at the table. He named no names. The congregation exhaled relief and guilt together, a chorus of careful denials. After the benediction, Mrs. Vale caught him by the sleeve. You didn't say which field has the wolves. The field where we keep our hopes, he answered too quickly. That is where they feed best. In Mr. Harrow's shop, bottles caught the window light, like a cold choir. Avery Pike's story, a door that breathed ribbons in a row, a ledger written twice, arrived as if it had walked. The apothecary closed his book over his finger and looked at the floorboard. Lavender and vinegar can make a room smell like kindness, he said. Laudanum can make a boy sleep through anything he doesn't want to remember. But I sell to the whole county. I sell to saints and to the men who keep them polite. What do you want from me? An opinion, the blacksmith said from the doorway, ash on his cheek. Not a receipt. My opinion is that need builds altars as quickly as faith, Harrow said. And we've had a famine of both. At the general store, the wall clock began running a minute slow after the Morton school opened. The owner wound it twice as often. It still lagged, as if time itself had chosen to be cautious. Geese, turning early above the river, veered north, reconsidered, and veered again, drawing questions in the air they did not answer. A dog that spent its days asleep by the pot-belly stove would wake at dusk and stare at the road to the hill, ears pricked, tail low, waiting for a sound the rest of them pretended not to hear. I dreamed the bell last night, the baker confided to his wife while dusting sugar over a tray of buns. Only it wasn't ringing, it was inhaling. Then don't exhale, she said, not looking at him. Not until the season changes. Vestry minutes, written in a hand that had seen too many funerals, recorded an anonymous benefaction that kept the roof from leaking in the sanctuary. No one asked who, because they liked dry hymnals. The donation arrived the same week. Mr. Harrow sold a larger-than-usual bottle of tincture to a woman with Temperance's careful mouth. Sheriff Dwyer folded his report and put it in a drawer that already contained other drawers. When pressed later, he would say, "They gave me tea and I counted beds." The boys looked orderly. He did not use the word docile where the mothers could hear him. He did not mention that Clara poured the tea and did not drink hers. Maybe it's best not to stir it, Jonas Reed muttered over his anvil. We've seen enough stirring. He meant war and debt and boys who did not come back. He meant the need to call a hill holy because the flat ground had become too difficult. Maybe it stirs itself, Luke countered, tying his feed sack shut. Maybe that's what bells are for. The town hid itself from its own questions, which is another way of smoothing them into the shape of faith. What is easier, to doubt the hill, or to doubt the hope you sent there dressed in your son's only coat? Truth, in such places, is a shy animal. It lives in hedgerows, looks like a shadow if you see it at all, and runs if called by name. The chorus continued, careful in its denials, keeping time to a metronome no one admitted hearing. He tells it in a kitchen the color of old pewter where steam ghosts. The window in a clock ticks 1 second behind itself. Years have trembled his hands, not his voice. Tin cools slower than fear, he says, and sets a soldering iron aside as if the past might burn if touched too soon. I was 12, he begins, and my name did not travel well. They shortened it at the hill. Fintan became Finn, because the rest of the syllables seemed foreign to their mouths. He smiles without warmth. At the seminary, slowness was corrected. Names, too. He remembers Clara's lessons best. Not the content, never the content, but the rhythm. She read like she owned the silence between words, he says. When she said, breathe, we did. It was like a tide knew us by name. In the 3rd week the light changed. Lessons moved to evening, when the windows were more mirror than glass, and the lamps made halos in the dust. They gave us ribbons, he says, rubbing his thumb and forefinger together as if feeling the nap of cloth. Blue for the compliant, red for the restless. The white ribbon appeared once, only once. Unable, he was a singer, didn't know when to stop. He looks down at his teacup. He went walking to the well with Miss Clara and did not come back to his bed. Did you ask? The woman who took down his words asked softly. She is not family. Perhaps an archivist. Perhaps a late believer in late justice. I did not know how to ask in a way that would be answered, he says. There were right questions and wrong questions. The right ones made you better. The wrong ones were exercises. He speaks about a room whose window did not open. Painted shut so clean, it looked like the idea of a window, he says. In that room, Clara folded her hands like a closed book while boys learned the arithmetic of obedience. He remembers the bell best when no one touched it. It sounded like a throat choosing to say no and being corrected into yes. Hunger took on new shapes there. It became a schedule, he says. Soup thinned on Wednesdays, bread withheld on what she called quiet supper, milk only after you could hold your breath to the count of 30, with your hands flat on the desk. He glances at the kettle, listening. Hunger is a very teachable thing. What did they do? She presses, then regrets the bluntness. He shakes his head. I remember what was missing. Hours with no edges. We walked in and out of them and could not say where we'd been. After evening reading, there were exercises. She would say, breath is a leash, let me hold it, and then he stops, eyes chasing the past along the wall, voices. Ours, not ours. We spoke as if the words had been laid out for us beforehand. I am quiet. I am steady. I am small as a glass of water. Who wrote those words? The woman asks. Someone who liked order, he says. Someone who thought stillness was a kind of virtue you could tie on like a ribbon. He shows a thin scar around his wrist, pale and surprised looking. Rope, burn, he explains. From the well bucket. I tried to pull something heavy up once. Mud answered. Not what I wanted. He rubs at it as if the memory might flake off. We washed our hands in vinegar until our skin forgot it was skin. The smell lived in my mouth. Sometimes there was a sweetness under it, almond, maybe, that might be the part my mind is making more elegant than it was. He remembers Clara's hands always folded, always still. She never touched the bell with more than a palm, he says. and the sound when it came was not a ring, more like a metronome sighing. He laughs, a sound with no joy in it. Her voice felt like kindness wearing gloves. He ran on a Thursday, he says, because Thursday looked tired of itself. He followed a line of fence posts that did not lead to town so much as away from the hill. I did not pick the road. I picked the direction that was not her voice. The sky was tin. The grass kept its frost through noon. A dog he did not know trotted at his side for a mile, then stopped and would not cross a ditch, as if that ditch were a sentence with a period he had to respect. "Did they come after you?" the woman asks. "Not right away," he says. "I was not collection day. They had a calendar for that." I listened for the bell and heard only the wind trying to be useful. When he reached a farm that smelled of wet hay and generosity, an old couple fed him without asking much. The man said, "We are very far from trouble here," he recalls. "I slept with my boots on and dreamed of the classroom clock. I woke to it in my head, except there was no hand to show me where I was." He did not go back. The hill turned into a story other people told, then a silence he kept because it paid him back with less thinking. "As I aged," he says, "the truth I could carry grew smaller, ornately carved by forgetting. Heavy as a thimble. He insists on one thing. He repeats it so it cannot be misfiled." Her voice felt like kindness, wearing gloves, he says. "That's the closest I can come to what the danger was." The kettle pitches into a whistle. The clock ticks its slow second. Outside, crows debate a naked elm as if the tree had choices it refused to make. The woman closes her notebook, unsure what she has collected, evidence or echoes. "What is truth?" she asks. Not of him, but of the room. A ledger, a scar, a sentence we can't stop hearing. He does not answer. Some hours were taken from him, and no interview can return them. In their place is a pattern, quiet as hunger, specific as a ribbon laid out in a row, until it means something you cannot name without losing it. Authority came on horseback and left in good order. Late spring had softened the ruts and freckled the ridge with violets that refused to apologize for their color. The circuit judge, Horace Bellamy by some accounts, rode up with a clerk who coughed into a handkerchief printed with ships that had never touched the county. The sheriff, Emmett Dwyer, met them at the gate. Reverend Meacham arrived walking, hat held like a verdict he was not prepared to deliver. Inside, the seminary smelled of lye, lamp oil, and something sweet that did not belong to either. Temperance Morton received them with a ledger already under her arm, as if a good book could keep away bad questions. Elijah stood behind her with a stewardship smile. Clara poured tea into thin china and did not drink hers. Judge Bellamy opened his own notebook, blue paper lined like fields waiting for seed. "Routine inquiry," he said, voice and pen both even. "Mrs. Morton, your books." Temperance placed the ledger on the table with the reverence of anyone who has learned that paper can absolve, attendance in an even hand. Dispensations noted for fever, fainting and temperament, signatures neat as lace, each curl identical to the one before it as if taught to repeat without fatigue. "Your hand?" he asked. "We alternate," Temperance said, "my daughter and I." He traced a finger over the marbled flyleaf, where a watermark showed itself when tipped toward the window. Eaton and Co., Haverhill. The judge noticed, because noticing paper had become a habit. Later in Clara's letters, he would see the same watermark and not write down what that meant. "Rooms?" Sheriff Dwyer suggested, eager to count things that would stay counted. They walked the dormitories, rows of beds made so tight a coin could salute the sheets and bounce back into a boy's hand with a lesson already attached. The schoolroom clock ticked. Its hands were exact. A list of rules was posted in a clean frame. Wash, breathe, a chart titled Hygiene for the Young, hung beside a diagram of the body flayed into clean Latin. The reverend's lips moved. Prayer or reading, no one could say. "The well," Judge Bellamy said. Elijah led them out. The rope, new. The bucket, dry. A mare tied near the fence extended her neck to drink, then stalled, ears quivering, and waited until Elijah fetched water from a barrel instead. "Skittish," Elijah said, a thread of irritation in the cloth of his voice. She prefers the familiar. Clara spoke as if the air were hers to divide. It runs clear, Your Honor. We add lime in summer for purity. The boys are instructed not to lean. Back inside, the judge requested a moment with Clara alone. In the small parlor, sunlight pooled on the braided rug without entering the corners. A painting of a harbor tilted slightly. Ships went about their business in the frame, ignorant of the land that needed them to be metaphors. Miss Morton, he began. Judge, she answered, folding her hands like a book that contained its own index. You isolate boys? When necessary, she said. Disruptive elements are quarantined until their souls remember their proper shape. Breath is the first disorder. Breath is also the cure. Quarantined is a medical term. Sin is contagious, she said. So is fear. We practice moral hygiene. It is kinder to the group. He watched her choose each word as if selecting birds from a wire. The boy who wore a white ribbon, he said at last. Where is he now? Clara's eyes did not dim or brighten. They were a shoreline that offered no harbor. From the desk she produced a folded letter sealed in brown wax and handed it to him as one passes bread. The boy's uncle in Indiana. He reclaimed his kin with gratitude. He cracked the seal. The handwriting was bucolic and grateful to the point of performance. Thank you for restoring the boy's tranquility, for returning him to us quiet and industrious. God bless this seminary where correction is not cruelty but care. The signature curled handsomely. J. Barrow, Terriet. The paper was good. Eaton & Co. Haverhill. The flourish on the R looked very much like temperances in the ledger. He did not hold that thought long enough to own it. My clerk will note the file, he said, passing it back though she had not asked him to. Sheriff? Dwyer cleared his throat. Premises in good order, he recited. Dormitories clean. Pupils of sound appearance and docile beyond their years. No complaint beyond the ordinary trembling of youth. Reverend Meacham removed his hat and polished nothing from its brim. Let us pray that such diligence remains, he said, then prayed without names. Words went up, obedient as smoke. The corners kept their shadows anyway. The judge walked one more time through the corridors, letting his fingers brush the plaster as if it might flinch. He stopped at a door whose paint had been coaxed smooth as a lie told for someone's benefit. This room? For supplies, Temperance said. The key on her chain found the lock with the intimacy of long practice. Shelves, vinegar, folded cloth, a metronome asleep in the dark. The judge closed the door. It inhaled with relief. He wrote his report at the table where the tea had gone cold. Irongull ink bled slightly, blooming patience into each letter. No cause for alarm, he wrote, no sign of neglect. Systems of correction in place, consonant with the aims of a moral academy. His pen hovered, he added. Recommend seasonal oversight, a phrase that meant nothing and sounded like care. On the porch he paused to tuck his book away. A wind moved through the bell frame, and the metal made a sound like a throat preparing to speak. Clara looked up at it without surprise, then at him without appeal. How do you indict a tone of voice, he asked the sheriff later, not expecting an answer. Dwyer tugged at his glove. You can't weigh a lullaby, he said. You can write that it was sung. The file closed upon itself like an eye. The minister blessed the paper. The sheriff nodded. The judge mounted, his mare grateful for the road that did not ask questions. Failure here was not a lack of effort, but a mismatch. What could be measured, and what refused to be weighed. The hill kept its cosmetics, the ledger its neat rehearsals, and the system sated by documents that folded and unfolded without squeaking, rode away without a shadow. Somewhere behind them the bell remembered how to keep time. Truth did not arrive with the clarity of a trumpet blast. It came instead as a tangle, a skein of voices, each pulling in its own direction, each insisting on its own thread of the pattern. A farmhand named Caleb Wren swore he had seen lanterns moving in pairs at midnight, their light bobbing like will-o'-the-wisps along the ridge path. He claimed Clara and her mother walked ahead of them, counting steps toward the ravine in a rhythm too precise to be casual. Not prayer, he told the cooper over a pint, more like measuring something that didn't want to be measured. A seamstress in town, Miss Elspeth Dawes, said Clara had once brought her a dress to mend. Fine muslin, the hem stained with something that was not the color of any fruit she knew. It wasn't rust, she said, and it wasn't wine. It was deliberate. She would not explain what she meant by that. The traveling preacher, Reverend Silas Gray, was less consistent. One week he praised the seminary from the pulpit, calling it a lantern on the hill. The next, he condemned it as a place where the soul is taught to kneel before the wrong altar, claiming a dream had convinced him. When pressed, he described the dream: a bell tolling underwater and boys walking toward it with their mouths open. Two girls from the kitchen staff whispered their own contradictions. "She reads French poorly," one said, "but sings in Latin like she was born to it." The other added, "Sometimes the song isn't a hymn. Sometimes it sounds like she's calling something in. They would not say what." Among the boys, the stories frayed further. One said Clara had cried while washing his hands in vinegar, her tears falling into the basin as if she were baptizing him in something neither of them could name. Another swore he had never seen her blink, not once in all the months he was there. Each account kept 1 foot in the real and 1 in the fog. Caleb Wren needed his story to be a warning, perhaps to justify why he never went near the ridge again. Miss Dora's tale carried the weight of a private suspicion she could not prove. Reverend Gray's shifting sermon seemed to serve his own restless conscience. The kitchen girl's whispers were half fear, half fascination. The boys' memories were shaped by what they could not afford to remember. Clara, seen from every angle at once, became both angel and architect, the savior in one telling, the engineer of harm in another. This is the danger and beauty of testimony. It multiplies what it cannot pin down. The rope burns the hands that pull, yet still they pull, hoping the shape at the other end will resolve into something they can name. Memory, that eager artisan, braided the strands until they held, then frayed them where they threatened to become a noose. The contradictions did not cancel each other, they coexisted, like shadows cast by different lamps on the same wall. Somewhere inside that shifting silhouette was a figure, and that figure kept smiling as if it knew the truth was not a single thing to be found, but a weave that would always loosen the moment you thought you had it in your grasp. It came to light the way certain truths do, not by pursuit, but by accident. A storm had bullied its way across the ridge, tearing shingles from roofs and pushing trash into places that had long kept themselves tidy. In the yard of a retired schoolmistress, a barrel rolled from its corner and split against a stone. Beneath the silt and seeds it spilled lay something heavier than refuse, a book bound in cracked calfskin, its clasp rusted shut, like a mouth that had been holding its breath for decades. When the clasp finally yielded, the smell was the first thing. Paper and damp, but also something faintly sweet, like almonds left too long in a jar. Inside, the pages were a study in discipline. Names reduced to initials, as if identity itself had been pared down for efficiency. Columns with titles blurred to humility. Conduct, correction, conversion. The left-hand entries were inked in a hand so steady it could have been traced from a ruler. The right-hand entries were paler, as though written in water and left to dry into ghosts of themselves. Patterns emerged for those willing to look. Every 5th day, certain initials appeared with the notation, "Quieted." Asterisks bloomed beside boys known, from other, older whispers, to have worn blue ribbon. The white ribbon appeared only once, and the line it marked ended abruptly, without the neat closing curl that finished all the others. Between 2 leaves, a violet had been pressed and forgotten, its petals bleeding into the paper until the crease looked bruise-colored. On the backboard, someone had tested wet ink with a fingertip, leaving a whorl like a signature that could not be forged, a fingerprint without a name. Years later, scholars would argue over the meaning of those columns. Was quieted a commendation for calm behavior, or a verdict passed in euphemism? Did the asterisks mark achievement, punishment, or something in between? Why did the white ribbon's single appearance coincide with a line that refused to finish itself? The ledger did not answer. It was not built to. It was built to persuade, to satisfy anyone who loved rows more than faces, order more than truth. One archivist, turning the pages under a lamp, noticed the watermark Eaton and Co. Haverhill. The same paper stock had been found in letters attributed to Clara Morton, though no one could prove the connection without admitting how much they wanted it to be there. The watermarks whispered their own question, one the ink could not smother. What is recorded for the world and what is recorded for the hand that writes? In the kitchen where the ledger was first shown, the retired schoolmistress traced the bruise-colored violet with a fingertip. They kept flowers, she said, though her voice made it sound like an accusation. The neighbor, leaning over her shoulder, shook his head. They kept records, he replied. Neither was wrong. Outside, the storm's debris still littered the yard. The wind had moved on, but the air felt as if it were holding something back. And in the ledger, the pale right-hand entries waited, not to be read, but to be believed. With certainty unavailable, language itself became the scalpel, each profession carving the same wound into a shape it could name. The physician came first, a man with pince-nez and the faint smell of carbolic about him, recently returned from a season in Paris, where the journals spoke of the mind as if it were a clock one could reset. He diagnosed the seminary with moral insanity, not a lesion in the flesh, but a bend in the instrument that measures conscience. It is not madness, he told the county clerk, but a defect in the compass by which one steers the soul. He spoke of mesmerism, of suggestion, of Clara's voice sliding past the boy's defenses like a trained surgeon slipping between ribs without disturbing the breath. A tone, he said, can be more invasive than a blade. The minister, Reverend Meacham, reached for older categories, the ones that had served centuries before medicine learned to name itself. Possession, he said from the pulpit. Temptation, the seductions of power wrapped in lace. He warned of wolves in the clothing of shepherds, though his eyes never left the back pew where Temperance Morton sat, hands folded, face serene, a widow whose son had returned. Altered believed in neither diagnosis nor sermon. It was hunger, she told the grocer, weighing out flour. Not the kind that gnaws the belly, the kind that mimics discipline so closely the world applauds it. They starved something in him until it behaved. Others went older still, and deeper. The farmer, leaning on his fence, swore there was a spring under the hill that soured milk and made men dream of knives. Water remembers, he said, and not all memories are fit to drink. An itinerant scholar, his coat shiny at the elbows, muttered about rites that use bells to summon obedience. Each toll a command the body answers before the mind consults itself. You can train a heartbeat, he said, if you know the right pitch. None of it proved anything. All of it circled like wolves around a fire, eyes catching the light, but never stepping close enough to be counted. Theories are comfort for those who cannot bear the freefall of we don't know. They are also, in their way, an attempt to honor harm by naming it, to give shape to the shadow so it cannot slip entirely into the dark. In the parlors and feed stores, the arguments braided and frayed. Was Clara a practitioner of the new sciences, bending will with the precision of a laboratory? Or was she an old-world temptress, her hymns a veil for something older than scripture? If the age could not decide whether evil wore a lab coat or a cassock, perhaps that was because it had chosen, instead, a dress and a soft voice, and discovered that both could be worn at once. He came on the morning train from the city, stepping down into the pale spring light with his gloves still white from the journey. Professor Aldous Van, known in lecture halls for his exacting diagrams and in salons for his aversion to speculation, carried a notebook bound in black calfskin and a curiosity that bordered on reverence for his own method. He had been sent, or perhaps had sent himself, to examine the seminary with the same instruments he used for lecture demonstrations. Measure, sample, compare. In the city, such things yielded conclusions. On the hill, the ground moved differently. The Mortons received him in the main hall where dust motes hung like unspoken questions. Temperance offered tea. Elijah offered a tour. Clara stood by the window, her eyes as steady as the bell's shadow. "The well, if you please," Van said. He carried a brass yardstick and a leather satchel that chimed faintly when he walked. The well's mouth was black glass under the midday sun. Van measured its depth, lowered a small tin cylinder, and drew up water with the detachment of a man weighing rainfall. He decanted samples into glass vials, corked them, and labeled each in his exacting script. "Clear," Elijah noted. "Clear does not mean empty," then replied without looking up. In the classroom, he inventoried the bones in the glass front cabinet: radius, ulna, a skull with 3 teeth missing. "Educational," he pronounced. "Likely purchased from suppliers who trade in the dead with paperwork in order." He wrote this as if the legitimacy of bones was simply a matter of ledgers balancing. He paced the floorboards, listening. No hollow echo, no loose plank to betray a hidden cavity. He counted steps between the bell's frame outside and the dormitory door, 42, each identical in length. He found nothing to satisfy anyone who demanded a brick in the hand, nothing that would, on its own, produce a headline or a trial. It was in the dining hall that he noticed the first irregularity. The blackboard menu, written in Temperance's looping script, revealed a rhythm. Meals reduced, then increased, in a cycle neat enough to plot on a chart. Bread lightened for 3 days, then restored. Milk absent on Tuesdays, abundant on Fridays. Rationing, then asked. Correction, Temperance said. The body follows the soul when the soul is led. He compared the mealtime cycles to the entries in the ledger he was shown that afternoon. The same days, the thin days, were marked in the margins with a single word: quiet it. Music lessons appeared on those days as well, the pieces noted in Clara's precise hand. On 2 such dates, additional lines were added: fits of grace. He inquired about them. Moments of moral clarity, Clara explained, often accompanied by trembling, not to be feared. In his notebook he recorded the phrase, fits of grace, psychosomatic, induced by fasting, phthmic equidatory stimulus. He wrote it as a question, but his script was so confident it might as well have been an answer. That evening Venn sat in the study the Mortons had offered him, reviewing his notes under lamplight. It was there he began to suspect that deprivation was the true curriculum. Food, warmth, speech, even the recognition of one's own thoughts, all offered and withdrawn in patterns as deliberate as any laboratory schedule. Dependency, cultivated with pastoral care, trimmed into obedience like a hedge into shape. The next morning, before leaving, he walked the grounds alone. A pair of swallows darted over the clearing. The bell, unmoving, seemed to wait for something that wasn't him. At the well he heard his own breath echo back, thinner than when he had sent it down. On the train he labeled his samples with the date and location. Beside them, in smaller script, he wrote, "The harm here is crowded with absence. What is not fed, not named, not allowed to remain itself." He knew that in his lectures he would present only the measurable mineral content in the water, density of floorboards, caloric estimates from menus, but in a private journal he allowed a different sentence. There are forms of cruelty, so careful they resemble devotion. He closed the book on the words before the ink was dry. It would not change the hill. Science had mapped the angles of emptiness but had no instrument to fill them. Outside the carriage window the land unrolled toward the city, leaving behind a ridge where certainty refused to root and where absence measured, plotted, perfected, kept its own unassailable shape. They surfaced years later in the back corner of a rural auction, a long table of trunk-lot miscellany under buzzing strip light. No one came for the hand-stitched linens or the empty snuff tins. It was the battered cedar box that held the true relics. Inside, folded pages, their ink faded to the hue of dying embers, their edges powdered with time. The handwriting was slow, deliberate, the same snowfall-paced script found in the seminary's ledger, where dates advanced, like cautious footsteps. Each letter bore an address, but none the post could have ever delivered to the keeper of the second silence, to the room without doors, to whomever still believes in the first light. The sentences were stitched like the underside of prayer, where knots and crossings hide the smooth embroidery above. I hold their hands until they stop shaking. No one taught me how to let go. Another, he is kind when he wears his public face. We must all learn when to change our faces. She described a program of quieting, a sequence of diminishing returns on voice and self, symphonies of breath, staking the soul to a stillness, so the mind might rethread, words chosen like fine threads, some to illuminate, some to obscure. Nowhere did she write violence, everywhere she wrote control. One page stood apart, an account of a winter night when, in the unheated dormitory, a boy with a red ribbon rose from his cot and sang in a language he could not have learned. Our song returned to us, Clara wrote, but it had teeth. No explanation followed. In the margin, a single square of ink blotted out what might have been an ending. Not a line through the words that would have implied a striking away, but a careful burial, as though the letters themselves needed interment. If language is confession's architecture, then Clara understood its load-bearing walls. The verbs mattered. She never wrote they. She always wrote we. We quieted her. We listened until the air was bare. We prayed with our faces turned from each other. Was it complicity? Was it captivity spoken in the grammar of inclusion? The distinction thinned until it was only as wide as breath. I imagined her at a desk in the corner of the dormitory after lights out, a stub of candle at her elbow, its light carving more shadow than illumination. Outside, the bell's silent weight against the frame. Inside, the sound of sleeping girls, their breath overlapping in a single slow tide. Clara, writing not to be found but to place the truth somewhere it might one day be stumbled upon, like a coin down the back of a drawer. In one unfinished letter, the ink drifted into faintness mid-sentence. Some prayers are not to God but to the next witness. Should you be that witness, know this. The paper ended there, torn, not cut. The auctioneer sold the box without ceremony to a man seeking kindling for his stove. Only by chance did the letters escape the fire. His granddaughter, curious about the strange handwriting, kept them in a shoebox under her bed. Years later they found their way into the archive of a historical society that understood little but kept everything. Reading them now, the mind circles the terrible possibility that Clara's voice occupied both edges of the blade, the hand that harms and the hand that soothes, inhabiting the same flesh, speaking through the same mouth. The dual occupancy of sin and solace. Like all true confessions, the letters tell us exactly what they must, while building a wall where the last sentence should stand. And as with all walls, one wonders less about what is on this side, and more about what waits on the other. The excavation began without ceremony. No gathered crowd, no press sketching in charcoal, just the scrape of metal teeth into soil and the low murmur of two men working a pulley. When the first bucket came up, everyone who had lingered at the lip of the well leaned forward as if the earth might blush and reveal its worst secret. But the bucket held nothing more than the familiar odor of drowned leaves and old iron. Over the next days they pulled from the silt a scatter of objects so ordinary they took on a kind of defiance. A mother-of-pearl button, its luster worn to a soft sigh. A tin cross bent neatly into the shape of a fish, as though faith itself had been persuaded to swim another direction. Hair ribbons the color leached until they matched the teeth of the old women who came to watch. And 4 crotal bells from a horse's harness greened with corrosion, each still capable of giving off a faint rattle when shaken. Each find was a sentence fragment, torn from its paragraph. The archaeologist, a narrow-shouldered man from the university, handled them with the delicacy of a priest, lifting communion wafers. Objects are only ever the survivors of an event, he said to no one in particular. They are never the event itself. He noted, too, the well's peculiar acoustics. Sound rose in a spiral, unwinding itself as it climbed, so that whispers became flat proclamations by the time they reached daylight. Children might have leaned over its rim with strings, lowering trinkets the way others lower wishes. Adults might have bent their heads toward its darkness, listening for some note of absolution, and heard only their own resolve echoed back to them, hardened. Across the yard, a second team worked with spades, the rhythm of their shovels unbroken by speech. When the soil gave up a line of flat stones, there was a momentary stillness, the kind born of wondering if one has just struck the edge of a grave, but the line curved and doubled back on itself, a boundary wall for something long vanished. Near what had once been a hearth, they found the delicate shells of almonds, still pale within their char, and the cloudy glass of laudanum bottles, some intact, some cracked along their seams. The dig supervisor ran a thumb over one bottle's neck, then set it gently on the pile with the others. If there was horror here, and the hopeful eyes of the onlookers betrayed that many had come expecting to see it, it did not arrive in the form of spectacle. No skeletons rising into the air, no implements of punishment to confirm rumor into fact. Instead, it whispered from the poverty of proof, the small, stubborn things that survive precisely because they are overlooked. Buttons and ribbons, bent tin and empty bells, the residue of decisions rather than the evidence of crimes. Arranged on a cloth, they resembled a rosary whose beads had been taken from different hands, different pockets, different decades, each a mystery without its decade-long prayer. We want bones because bones remove doubt. Bones declare, here is the harm, here is its measurement, here are the names we can engrave on stone, but sometimes all we inherit is what someone held in the moment before they chose what kind of person they were going to be. The ribbon let fall into dark water, the bottle drained beside a fire, the cross folded into a secret shape. The well gave back no answers, only tokens, and tokens, unlike bones, keep their meanings to themselves. The fire came in October, when the leaves had already crisped into the color of rust. It started, they said, in the far dormitory, the one with the cracked lintel, and the draught beneath every sill. No one perished, the report assured, but smoke wrote its own parable across the sky, a pillar that could be read for miles, a warning and an ending in the same stroke. By November the frost clung to the windows, and by December the Mortons were gone. No indictment, no summons, only the quiet folding of their charter into a worn carpet bag. Witnesses said they took the West Road at first light, their departure timed to the bell's absence, the last echo dying against the hill before the coach wheels began to turn. Where they opened that carpet bag again, the seal was different, a new embossing over the old, as if history were merely a document to be recopied until no one remembered the first hand that signed it. Sightings followed like lanterns glimpsed through the branches of moving trees, bright enough to tempt pursuit, gone before one could step closer. A woman with Clara's exact date, teaching elocution in a Kansas schoolhouse whose floors hummed when walked upon. A man with Elijah's jawline, his hat low over his brow, collecting fees for a manual academy beside a river where the current changed the banks each spring, and names with it. Meanwhile, the boys they left behind, now men, bore the hill in their posture. One would step around bells in city squares without seeming to notice he had done it. Another married a woman whose voice could never pierce the air above conversation. Some built homes with doors arranged in patterns unfamiliar to the carpenter, as if refusing symmetry was a form of resistance. Others built their lives by inversion, ensuring their tables were always loud with guests, their children never silenced for thought, their mornings free of ritual. Each carried absence differently, like men who had once been taught the same dance and now spent their lives inventing ways to forget the steps. The rumor, and it traveled with the strange persistence of a toothache one cannot keep from touching, was that the Mortons had not ended anything at all. They had merely translated themselves, softened their vowels to match new congregations, traded hymns for others with the same number of beats between refrain and instruction. Serial? Yes, but not the way broadsheets crave, with dates and corpses to map in columns. Their seriality was the way mold travels, invisible until the air thickens, the repetition of methods in different rooms, with different curtains, until the furniture forgets it was ever arranged another way. That is the secret cruelty of certain horrors. They arrive willing to alter their costume, to meet the expectations of those who host them. In this they are terribly like Hope. Hope also walks into a room wearing the face you most wish to see, speaks the words you have been waiting for, and makes you believe that what you are taking in is salvation right up to the moment you taste the same ash on the air. What happened on that hill did not end with the extinguishing of lamps or the rolling of wheels down the West Road. It continued in quieter courts where there were no bailiffs and no stenographers, only the long wooden benches of the mine. There, testimony arrived as dreams and refusals, as the small rituals by which people mark the borders of what they can carry. The tinsmith, who had once hammered light into plates for the dining hall, woke, sweating from visions of ribbons cinched too tight, his palms searching the dark for knots that weren't there. The widow in the White House by the mill traced the word quieted in the copy of the ledger she'd wrung from a cousin at the archive, stroking the letters until the paper thinned and the word became more air than ink. The former sheriff, who had grown hawkish and hard in the years since, denied every rumor in public. But on his last night, with morphine dulling the edges, he asked for the ledger to be brought to his bed. He touched its cover, said nothing, and let his hand rest there like a confession seeking a mouth. Memory is not a ledger, it is a stage. It arranges the furniture to suit the night's performance. It sets a chair beneath the lamp for one face, and keeps another in the shadow behind the curtain. And like any decent stagehand, it refuses certain commands. Try to force it, and it will simply dim the lights, lower the curtain, and leave you to describe what you thought you saw to an empty hall. To demand perfect recall from the harmed is to deny the harm's most persistent effect, the rearrangement of time. In one life, the bell still rings before breakfast. In another, the bell is the sound by which dusk finds you no matter where you have gone. There is no transcript that can rescue what was taught in the currency of silence. Psychologists came later with hypotheses about suggestion, about the pliability of memory under pressure. Priests arrived with phrases polished by centuries, forgiveness without admission, letting go without naming the hand that held. They circulated these like coins, worn from passing between fingers. But in kitchens and barns where flour dust glowed in morning light and old straw murmured beneath boots, the truest language emerged. I know what I felt. I can't prove what was done. I can't stop hearing the bell. The sentences were short because breath is short when one stands at the edge of a remembered room. There is, in such speech, a dignity, the willingness to leave space where certainty wants to raise its heroic statue. Yet, the open ground is not without danger. Ambiguity can be a sanctuary for the cruel, a fog thick enough to hide in. Rumor builds there, yes, but so do defenses slick as river stones. No bones. Someone says, no case. No names. Another says, no sin. Between the hill of not enough proof and the valley where the body trembles at a tone it trained itself to forget, the law of the self must choose a flag. Some plant theirs high, insisting that only what can be exhibited in court deserves a verdict. Others set theirs low, amid the grasses where the wind moves like a remembered hand through hair, and call that movement evidence enough. In the end, each resident of the county carried a private jurisprudence. A farmer would avert his eyes from the bell's iron curve, arguing with himself, what is truth? Is it the accumulation of artifacts, or the long ache a sound can make in a life? A teacher would pause mid-hymn, hearing a harmony that did not belong and choosing carefully to sing through it. A child, grown now with children of her own, would pass a schoolhouse and find her throat narrowing, an ancient collar closing, and recognize the decision rising in her to turn away or to stand and swallow air until it widened again. The law of the self is not codified. It is practiced. It is revised each time a hand reaches for a door and stops, because the hinges ring a certain way. It is the quiet verdict pronounced when a man buys a clock with a wooden tick instead of a bell, when a woman chooses a church without a tower. It is the refusal to let ambiguity erase a wound, and the equally stubborn refusal to let certainty become its own kind of cruelty. By the time she began her work, the seminary existed only as an aftertaste in the county's conversations, mentioned briefly, then set aside like an awkward family photograph. She was retired from the library, her pension barely enough to keep her in tea and postage stamps, but her patience was inexhaustible. More than that, she possessed the rare appetite of those who would rather know an incomplete truth than live with a comfortable lie. Her name was Margaret Lyle, though in her own mind she had taken on the role of keeper, a title she never said aloud. She walked the town's periphery, listening for the slip in a shopkeeper's voice, the pause that marked where a memory had been folded in half and hidden. She sought Clara not in monuments, there were none, but in the stray offcuts of survival. A torn page from a hymn book used to steady a chair. A timetable for classes where music and quiet exercise occupied the same hour, a pewter spoon worn so thin at the bowl that it looked like something dissolved in water and then returned. Letters that sounded less like correspondence than meteorological reports from the interior of a soul. Light snow, no wind, visibility poor. She worked from a small upstairs apartment that gradually transformed into a cartography of obsession. Maps pinned to the wall bloomed with colored thread, each string connecting a sighting, an archive note, an overheard description. Seen from a distance, it resembled a constellation, an invented one, with no guarantee that the stars so joined had ever truly shared the same sky. Obsession, the grocer said, seeing her once with dirt on her skirt from the riverbank. Stewardship, she replied, her voice the same even when corrected by no one. In her notebooks, one phrase returned again and again, drawn in the margin like a personal seal. If the bell is not here to ring, then I must be the bell. The body begins to keep the score of such work. Meals became interruptions. Stacks of paper arranged themselves around her chair like low walls until her own path to the door was a labyrinth. She began to hear it at night, a low, resonant tone curling along the baseboard, not quite in the air and not quite in her head. At first she dismissed it as pipes settling, but instinct made her place a recorder near the sound. When she played it back, the pitch was precise. She matched it, tremor in hand, to a century-old bell catalogue she had copied from the ledger found in a barn miles away. Model 6, cast iron, 12 inches. The shape of this coincidence enclosed her thoughts like a fence. The day she finally reached the hill, it no longer held a building. The land had been scraped, then surrendered to weeds and saplings, the ground still damp from the breath of the reservoir it bordered. Margaret stood where she believed the bell tower had once lifted its spine above the roofline. She waited, ears bending to the air for the sound she had carried for months inside her. But there was nothing except the wind, moving in small rehearsals among the branches. Still, she wrote that night in her journal, absence can be so loud it becomes its own evidence. The cost of insistence is this. Over time you begin to see the patterns you need to see. You arrange the light just so until it reveals the shape you've been hunting. The gift of insistence, however, is that sometimes, just often enough to keep you at it, the shape is truly there, and has only been waiting for the right eyes, the right stubbornness, to bring it into form. For Margaret Lyle, the distinction no longer mattered. Whether the bell existed or not, she had heard it. Whether Clara's story could be proven or not, she had traced its edges, and for some historians, the rare ones, that is both the fever and the cure. The reservoir came in the 1930s, rising like a patient tide. It arrived with the language of progress, surveys, measurements, the promise of power and clean water, and like progress often does, it drowned its trouble under utility. The hill where the seminary once stood disappeared first beneath mud, then beneath the slow insistence of the deepening pool. Foundations softened, timbers surrendered. By the time the water reached the bell tower's imagined height, the hill was less a place than a rumor the shoreline told itself on still mornings. On certain days when the wind comes from the north and the surface tires of being glass, people say they hear it, something metallic complaining below. A bell's cough, abrupt and hollow, a quirk of reeds in the shallows, or memory, always the better mimic, throwing its voice into the listener's chest. Families picnic nearby on blankets faded by the same sun that glints off the water. Children skip stones that plink into circles without bothering to count the echoes. Above the reservoir, dragonflies draw their erratic geometry. The Mortons' names, if indeed they were the Mortons, rest nowhere agreed upon. The county keeps no record of where they went, and perhaps that absence is a kind of record in itself. Clara, too, remains as she trained others to be, composed. Whether she wrote the ledger in her own hand or wore it like a glove over another's, her absence is as deliberate as her lines were measured. There is no marker here, only water and wind and the invisible lattice of what might still lie underneath. We do not end with justice. We end with something more difficult to live with. The knowledge that harm can be meticulous and still leave behind only a scatter of small things, that goodness is a shape easily adopted by those who understand that trust is as sharp a tool as any blade. The hill, gone but not gone, offers a thin lesson with the weight of iron. Beware any salvation that requires you to become very quiet first. If there is a bell inside us, let it be for the living as they are, not the arranged, not the corrected, not the quieted. Let it ring with the inconvenient, human pulse that resists becoming someone else's certainty. Some mysteries stay not to be solved, but to keep time for the questions we have the courage to ask. They toll in their own fashion, patient as dusk, loud as absence, keeping us attentive to what we might otherwise turn away from. The rest is water holding its secrets, wind bending a reeds, and a ledger closed so long the clasp has become part of the lock. Somewhere beneath it all a sound waits, not to be proven, but to be heard.